Hello, Man in Gray here with another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is Agape by William Gaddis, published in 2002. It has a afterword by Joseph Tabby, published in 2002 by Viking. It's 113 pages long. William Gaddis, who was born in 1922 and died in 1998, is considered by many to be the father of postmodernist fiction in the United States. His 1955 novel, The Recognitions, is considered by many to be the very first postmodernist novel in America. And when it was published, it's a long, almost 1,000-page novel about a ministerial student who becomes a art forger. And its complicated plot and non-linear narrative completely baffled people when it was published in the mid-50s. It got terrible reviews, and hardly anybody bought it. And Gaddis was so upset by the response to his novel that he'd worked on for 7 years that he abandoned fiction writing entirely for 20 years, supporting himself by working as a public relations agent for several multinational corporations. And that led to Gaddis's second novel, which he published in the mid-70s, called J.R., which is a satire on Wall Street, the stock market, and multinational corporations. This book, which was published posthumously 4 years after Gaddis's death, is by far the shortest of Gaddis's novels. And I don't want to say it's his most accessible, because the word accessibility and Gaddis don't really go together. Gaddis's books are always very challenging. For example, J.R. This is a book about an 11-year-old kid who goes on a school field trip to Wall Street and becomes obsessed with the stock market and builds up a secret financial empire by going to payphones and buying penny stocks. But the novel is told almost entirely in dialogue, and the dialogue is not attributed to anybody. So not only, as you're reading J.R., not only do you have to piece together the plot and the characters and the setting, but you also have to figure out who is talking, because Gaddis doesn't tell you who's talking, and there's no chapter break. So it's just this long, long list of unattributed dialogue. So it's quite intimidating. Well, this book is much shorter, and it only has one character, but it's also rather difficult because it's a stream of consciousness monologue by a dying man, and it also has no chapter breaks, and there's no paragraph. So it's just one long line of writing. There is punctuation, but not a whole lot. There's these enormously long sentences in this book. So even though it's only about 100 pages long, it's not an easy read. But of all of Gaddis's books, this is probably the one you may want to start with. This book is basically, like I said, there's a man who's dying, and he's got this internal monologue going, and he's ranting to himself about the history of player pianos, which is kind of a strange thing for a dying person to be obsessed with. But Gaddis himself, the character in this novel, is basically a version of Gaddis, and Gaddis was dying when he was writing this. Gaddis himself was obsessed with player pianos. He had boxes of documents that he collected over the years, newspaper clippings, magazine articles, books, transcripts about player pianos. Anytime he found anything about player pianos, he would collect it. His plan was initially to write a long nonfiction history of player pianos, but then he found out that he had terminal prostate cancer and decided to take this mass of data and turn it into a novel. And about the same time that he came up with this idea of writing a novel, he got a commission from Danish state radio to write a radio play. Gaddis's work has always been more popular in Europe than it is in America. And so he decided to write this book as a radio play. And then after the play was translated into Danish and performed, he decided to expand it, and he continued to tinker with the basic plot of this book, or the structure of the book, until his death, and it came out after his death. Now, why player pianos? What was the deal there? And what is a player piano? Some people may not be familiar with that, so let me take a minute and just kind of run through the history of player pianos real briefly. A player piano is a self-playing piano. They were invented in the 1870s, and they became popular after a fashion, and they were often found in bars and speakeasies and some more wealthier people's homes. They continued to be sold until the early 1930s, when the phonograph and the stock market crash and the Great Depression kind of put an end to player pianos. The way it works is there's a long roll of paper with holes punched in it, and you feed the paper through a series of rollers, and you either pump a pedal to get the rollers to work, or if it's an electrical piano, you flip a switch, and the paper's fed through these rollers, and the little holes flip levers that are connected to the keys, and so the piano can play itself using the holes cut into the paper as the guide. And it's a mechanical piano, so it plays itself, doesn't require any human input except to maybe pump the pedals to keep the rollers going. The actual playing is done by the machine itself. And it always plays the music exactly the same way. So it's kind of like a recording, except it's a live performance. It's just a live performance that's done by a mechanical piano. There was one composer who took advantage of one of the little side effects of the player pianos. By adding holes to the roll, you can get the piano to play notes that would be impossible for a human being to play. In fact, this was sometimes done. They would have a pianist make a recording. Had what were called recording pianos, where they had little pins that made little dots where the holes were to be. So a guy would play a tune, and then he'd go back and add extras to it. He'd add little arpeggios or extra chords or little frills or whatever. And so because the piano could play those, but one human couldn't. Well, there was one American composer, a composer from Texas named Conlon Nancarrow, who realized that you could write incredibly complicated, dense piano music using a player piano. So he built a machine, or he had a machine built, that would punch holes in a paper roll. And he spent years punching holes in various paper rolls according to complicated math formulas he developed. And he wrote a whole series of these pieces called Studies for Player Piano. And some of them are unbelievably dense. There's one piece that runs about 4 minutes, and it has over 10,000 notes in it. It's like a tsunami of music hitting you. It's just unbelievable. So that was the player piano. And they've made kind of a comeback in the last few decades because of computer technology. There's a number of piano companies, Yamaha, Sony, and Steinway, that I know of, that have installed computers into some of their piano models. And so you can download computer files into the piano, the computer module of the piano, and it will play the music. And so like the old paper rolls, only with computer files. And again, it plays the music exactly the same way every time. Okay, so that's the background of player pianos. Why was Gaddis so obsessed with this? And why is his fictional version of Gaddis so obsessed with it in here? Well, to Gaddis, the player piano epitomized one of the themes that he has that runs through all of his books, which is the dehumanization of technology. You've got a machine that can play music and play it exactly the same every time, and it doesn't need a human being to perform. And he saw that as being a terrible thing, taking the human element out of art. His first novel, The Recognitions, I mentioned, was about an art forger. In this novel, the art forger gets so good that people can't tell his forgeries from the actual original paintings. And so that, again, raises the question, well, what is art? If someone can copy art, or if art can be copied to the degree to where it can't be told from the original, then who creates the art? Is there a human element to art if it can be forged in that way? So I can only imagine, as I said, Gaddis died in 1998. I can only imagine if he had lived up until today and had seen what's happening with AI, artificial intelligence technology, because now not only can you have pianos that play themselves, you can have software that can write music. You can tell a piece of software, write a song like the Beatles, or write a Bach chorale, or write a jazz piece, and it will do that. And it can play it on a piano, or it can create a MIDI file and play an orchestra or whatever. And, it may, in the future, it may be impossible to tell whether music is written by a human being or whether it was created by software. And so This book is kind of prescient. Like 30 years ago, or almost 30 years ago, he was foreseeing kind of the culture that we have now. And that's the thing about Gaddis's books. And even though they're difficult and a lot of them are long and hard to read, he's an important writer because he was so far ahead of his time. The Recognitions, published in the mid-50s, reads like an experimental novel from the 60s. J.R., with its satire of capitalism and big business, reads like a novel written in the late 1980s and early 90s. And this book, of course, seems to kind of prefigures the debates we now have about artificial intelligence. So he's a fascinating writer, and this is a good place to start reading from. It is a long monologue. He incorporates a lot of his nonfiction material about player pianos, but as he goes along, he starts to wander off track and starts hallucinating because he's dying, and that's actually partly what was happening with Gaddis in real life, because he was on an anti-inflammatory drug whose side effects were hallucinations, psychotic behavior, and anxiety. And so some of the hallucinations in this book may have been actually happening to Gaddis while he was writing them, because he was on this drug. He was suffering from severe emphysema and had trouble breathing, and so they put him on this drug, and that helped him to breathe and helped him to focus more because he was getting more oxygen to his brain, but it was also affecting his mental state. So it's just a fascinating book to read. The afterword, it kind of explains a lot of the origins to it. But like I said, if you're interested at all in modernist, postmodernist writing, you have to at least dip your toe into William Gaddis's work, and Agape is a good starting point. The title, by the way, is a play on words. You've got two words. I think they're called homophones, where you have a word that's spelled the same way but pronounced differently. Agape is the Greek term for religious, spiritual love, the love Christians had for one another. There's a number of churches that refer to themselves as agape churches, where you're a brotherhood. And agape is when your mouth is wide open, usually because you're astonished by something, right? Or, people use the term open mouth astonishment, things like that. So it's a spiritual love connected to astonishment. And that's the play on words here. The book is Agape. The author is William Gaddis. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.